Welcome to another observability clinic, orchestrating your favorite DevOps platforms. The focus today is on how to integrate your DevOps tools using Dynatrace Webhooks in Dynatrace Cloud Automation, where Rob has already shown us in the other two videos we did on how Dynatrace can orchestrate end-to-end delivery workflows, integrating all of your favorite DevOps tools. We've seen Jira, we've seen GitLab, we've seen GitHub, we've seen JFrog, we've seen Slack, we've seen so many things. And then the other use case that Rob showed is how you can use Dynatrace Cloud Automation to orchestrate your problem remediation. And so that means reacting to a problem and then notifying the right people, hopefully automatically fixing the problem. And everything was centered around Dynatrace Webhooks. And Rob, these videos are really great from a use case perspective, but people were asking, really, what does this mean behind the scenes? How do these Dynatrace webhooks work? Can you give us a little bit more? That's why, Rob, welcome back to the stage and show us a little bit more about the webhooks and how this fits into cloud automation.
You bet. I'm excited. So this is the third, I guess, maybe if you watched what it can do, this is, as Andy said, going to dive into how it does it. But just if you're watching this video sort of out of context, we're talking about Dynatrace Cloud Automation. And so this is really around integrating our partner tools. So I work a lot with our current partners, wanting to grow our ecosystem of more partners, want to hear how you guys are doing it. And the first solution that Cloud Automation has is around webhooks to allow people to leverage their investments in their existing scripts, their existing ways of deploying things. And that's really what we're going to dive into, is really the nuts and bolts of how we actually make it happen. So first of all, I'll show product demos of all this stuff, but just get a little terminology around webhooks. So, and I'll just show a bit about how the Cloud Automation works in terms of sequences. But basically what we're going to have is two flavors of webhooks. So really where the Cloud Automation platform is sending something to a downstream system where there's no need for it to respond back. And so our classic example may be pushing a Slack notification to say, hey team, I did a deployment. Hey, here's an SLO evaluation results. Or maybe I'm just opening up a ticket and that particular system cannot send back confirmation. It just, hey, open up a ticket on my behalf. I'll kind of trust that it took place. Or a preferred way would be what we call active subscriptions, where the downstream system must respond back with confirmation that it did its task, and it can also include details about what it did. So it could be running a JFrog pipeline, for example, and then sending back the pipeline run information and status back, or running a performance load test, or maybe a chaos experiment that it can do the work and then send back the results. So these are just terminology wise. If you hear me say passive and active, that's what I mean. And this picture kind of shows the concepts. So let's just jump into demo. This is going to be a much more deeper dive into the product. And so here I am inside of Cloud Automation. So if you've not seen this, this is the UI. And the way you can think of Cloud Automation just in a structure is you can have one-to-many projects within your environment. So unlike something you're monitoring, this is a little bit more towards code and the developers and SREs. So you're organizing your artifacts and your config in the concepts of projects. And so I'm going to be focusing on this one project, and these links are public. It may be changing by the time of this video, but the projects should still remain out there. And so what happens in Cloud Automation is it's synchronizing your config into a repository. So I'm using GitHub, but this could be Azure DevOps. So it could also be Bitbucket. Basically, we've got support for a number of Git-based repos where your files are synchronized between the Cloud Automation environment and your what we call an upstream repository. So the key file of a project is called a shipyard file. So anytime you make a project, you have one of these files. So when you create a project, you're required to specify this. And the structure of these files is you have a concept of stages, and you can have one-to-many stages in your project. So that could be logically mapped to like a staging environment and a production environment, or it could just be a single stage as well. Maybe you just test. But then within a given stage, you have sequences. So you can have one-to-many sequences. And then within a sequence, it has one-to-many tasks. So that's sort of the structure. So project has stages, stages have sequences, sequence have tasks. And then, but we're not trying to reproduce a Jenkins file or a pipeline tool. We're really doing things in a declarative way. So each of these tasks, and this is important to understand the concepts here, when a sequence runs, what Cloud Automation is doing, and let's go into our release project, and let's take a look at one of our this sequence that's already run. So we're going to look at this because this is how it all works. So when you invoke a sequence, what happens is what's called a cloud event is pushed into the Cloud Automation control plane. So what's happening is there's basically a message bus that is receiving these cloud events. We call them cloud events, and then different services are listening for these events and acting upon these events. So a sequence always starts with a release. The name in the case of my sequence was called release. So it's the name of the sequence and then the triggered event. So there's 3 types of events. Everything is triggered, started, and finished. And you'll see that pattern. So when I start my sequence, it's triggered. And that's the release sequence. So then the sequence is made up of many tasks. So then when my task starts, my task gets a task triggered event. Okay. So then if someone is acting upon this deployment task, then in this case, I have a couple of webhooks listening for that. So then the webhook service, which I'll show you, is listening for that triggered event. And then what will happen is the Cloud Automation webhook will indicate that a webhook was subscribed to and that deployment has started. And that's what it's doing here. And then when it's done, the downstream tool, and I'll kind of get into the 2 flavors. So if the webhook service was not expecting the tool to return something, then the webhook service would say, I'm also finished. But if the downstream tool, like in this case, Gitlab, was doing something, Gitlab is responsible to send back a deployment finished event. So then that pattern of triggered, task, started, finished happens for each event within my sequence. So that's an important concept to understand, because as I get into the subscriptions, that's how you'll see what you're actually subscribing to. I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that, Andy, before I jump into a subscription.
No, I think that's perfect. I think what people need to understand is they can use Cloud Automation to, in a declarative way, describe sequences of tasks, and then Cloud Automation takes care of orchestrating these tasks, and it does it by sending events of the particular task name in the context of a sequence that belongs to a stage. And then, as you said, you can subscribe, for instance, through the webhook capability, a particular webhook to a certain event. So when a certain event is triggered, then you can say, I want to call a certain API, and either I want to wait for it because it's an active, as you call it, or I don't need to wait on it because I'm just calling an external API to let it know about a state. Yeah, exactly.
Right. So here I am. So now, as I mentioned earlier, there's a series of services. So what I've gone here is on the menu. Terminology wise, we call this the uniform area. So there are different services installed, different versions of these services. And as Dynatrace SaaS comes out with a new version, some of these individual services may also get updated with new features. But over here on the right, you can see what are the events that they're actually listening for. So we're going to drill into, because that's this webinar is around the webhook service. So one of the built-in services is called a webhook service. So I'm going to add one just to kind of walk you through how it gets configured, and then we'll run it and see what it actually did. So what happens is you are building a subscription based on some sort of task. So if you remember from our project, I have a series of tasks like deployment, evaluation, and so on. And so this dropdown is showing me those are tasks I want to listen to, and then which event type. So if I want to, when the task is triggered, which means it's sort of first running in the flow, I would be the triggered. And then what you're going to do is configure what do you want it to send something to. So it's typically an API endpoint of a tool. So it often is a post request, some URL, and then what you can do in the payload is you can send in data from these cloud events into your payload. And then you have a flag to say, do you want the webhook service to automatically send the started and finished event, or do you want the receiver of this event to be responsible to send something back? So this is the pattern of a webhook. Maybe we'll go look at one that's already configured just so you can see a real example. So in this case, I want to, as you can see here, I've got some notify, some tests, some deployments. Let's look at one of the notify ones. And so here, in this example, I'm actually going to this site called Webhook Site, which I'll show over here. So this is a site where you can listen for events, and we'll come back to the screen. So what it's doing is you can send a URL to this distinct site, and it will receive the payload. And then what we're going to be sending to it is, I want this payload of project service stage, and all these values are coming from the cloud event for this particular notify triggered process. If I go, just another example is I can also send it to a different tool. So in this case, I'm going to the API of Slack. So formatting got a little wacky here, but basically the Slack API has a token that you set up for an inbound receipt of a request, and then you're responsible to send in this required format, which looks a little funky here, but it's basically there's a payload and then a series of data. And what it will look like, just to show you, is it will build out this comment basically in a channel in Slack. So basically this will make this. Okay, now look at one more example here. Is if I go to a say a deployment triggered, what I'm doing here is I'm going to call a API of Gitlab. So in this case, I'm running a Gitlab pipeline, and it requires a token, API token, and the context type. And then here it has a very specific payload that API from Gitlab is expecting. So, but I can use all these placeholders, send it the project service stage, etc., so that it can act upon it. And then these secrets, you're wondering where those secrets came from. In Cloud Automation, you can build a secret with a name, and then you can give it the scope of the webhook service, and then you can build key value pairs. So if there's a API token or a URL that's an API that's also a secret, whatever you want, you can build a series of values in there. And so as you're building your webhook subscription, you can then refer to that in this nice little handy drop-down box. You can see I have a whole bunch. I have a GitLab token, I've got a Gremlin token, I've got a GitHub token. Various secrets are now protected. And the reason that's important is because, back to our project, when you save these subscriptions, they end up being stored in a YAML file also in my project. So it's important, and you can see, what it does when it invokes it is a curl command to that downstream system with the payload. So if there was a secret in here, you don't want, it's just a bad practice to put it in like a secret in clear text in your code repo. So that's just, so you can see like here, a secret Slack token, that's how it gets saved and the secret's not exposed. So that's why you would do it that way.
That's pretty cool. Yeah.
All right, so let's go ahead and run one of these real time. And I just noticed I took out for here. So this is how quick it is. So I want to, our last video, like I was doing something here. So I'm going to revert back and change my shipyard file. You can see how easy it is. I'm just going to make my staging flow. It's going to be a two-part step. So this sequence is called release. It's going to do a whole series of tasks. And you can see I have a bunch of things subscribing to these tasks. Then it's going to move on to a production sequence, which is waiting for the staging sequence to finish. And then it repeats some of those tasks. Let me just save that real quick. And the way I've got this triggering is I am actually I'll show you maybe how this does it too, but let's just say demo. I've got a Jira ticket, and we walked into the details on the last video of how this was done. But how this is doing is there's a great feature of cloud automation. Jira automation for Jira, sorry, a different automation that lets you see and configure things in Jira itself. So what I've got here is there's a whole other demo just to talk about this, but what automation for Jira allows you to do is to build basically a workflow of actions, and then they can be invoked. So basically off of an event. So when an issue was created, that's the one that I just did. What's it going to do? It's going to call my environment with the token and context of what I have, and then send it that event that I just started, that triggered release that we started off way in the beginning. So what the purpose of this is, I make a Jira ticket. Jira ticket's going to call this API of my cloud automation environment. So if I go over there, real-time demo, you can see my release has started because that automation for Jira ran, running that triggered release. And you can see it also passed in some other information as part of its work. So if I go back to Jira real quick, you can see it was saying, hey, I'm going to send you the Jira URL that I used, some other details. Also, I'm going to send back the project service stage you sent me. And that's what we see. That's what we see here in this event. So this is the event that Jira sent to start the sequence. So now, if we look at the notify, remember there was two different notify subscriptions taking place. So the first one was calling our Webhook site. So if you remember that had the Webhook site, now you can see what it did. So it received that event and it was populated in with some of that same data. So I just kind of passed it through like, hey, the Jira ticket got opened. Let me grab that out of the cloud event. Let me send that back to the next tool. And now I have that available here. I also pushed it to Slack. So here you can see that D3333 that just got made. This is now also got notified real time that took place. So if I go now to my next step, deployment, and what this was doing, I also had some webhooks running here. One of them was to Gitlab, as I showed you. So if I go into Gitlab, GitLab. Actually, I already have so it finished and it ran a JFrog. Sorry, while I was talking, it did a JFrog and a GitLab. It did both at the same time. Mm-hmm. And so when it sent back the finished results, I could see that it came from JFrog, and I'll show you where the code lives. Same thing with GitLab. GitLab, I also added an enhancement right before this to show how it can send back the URL to the pipeline that just ran. So, and then there's a feature called a label, so I can actually do hyperlink right to the job that just was invoked for that deployment task. So you can see I did a deployment, and not much to look at here other than it says running the deployment logic. Not too exciting. And then the other notify activity it was building up that cloud event and sending it to the cloud automation environment. So if I want to look at that code, just to show you that real quick, of the GitLab pipeline, it's just, if you're familiar with GitLab, it's assuming that the API of GitLab, this information was passed in. I passed in project service stage and the ID, which is in the company context, which is required to link it back to the sequence. So here you can see all it was doing was and triggered off of an API. I'm just gonna pretend I did some deployment, but imagine this was doing a real deployment. And then when it's completed, it's going to build up that JSON payload and then call the cloud automation API with the fact that the deployment finished event, you can see here, was completed. So that is the active example I mentioned earlier. So here, the webhook called GitLab. GitLab is responsible to build up this big message and send back the event to say it's done. So those are the two, and the pattern kind of continues with different tools, and that's what's kind of cool. In the other videos, we show, a whole bunch of different tools that use this same idea of it being either the passive or fire and forget approach, or this interactive or active approach, where the downstream tool can not only just respond, but you can see here, like often these tools have built-in variables, or you can put your own logic to say, hey, this was my job. This is my URL back to myself. Here is my, up here you can see I kind of just hard coded it as an example. I could say whether the job did what it was supposed to do. Did it fail? Did it error? whatever. And that's can now be augmented into this kind of more robust sequence. So I know there's a lot.
Yeah, but
so Andy, I don't know.
That's really cool. Rob, I want to just recap quickly because I think that maybe some people ask themselves, so why is this different to if I code everything in your favorite tool? I think what's different here is that we give you a declarative way to define your sequences, or call it processes, right, that you have. But then what we give you is the freedom to then, through event subscription, attach tools for particular projects to do a certain job. So that could be that you have the same processes in your organization, but maybe certain technology teams use Slack, some use maybe MS Teams, some use something else. And the thing is, because we are loosely coupling here the actual tools that execute on a task through event subscriptions, you can just subscribe a particular tool for a particular project, and maybe for another project you have another tool. And the nice thing is you don't need to worry about these integrations yourself. That means you don't need to build your own automation scripts that call tool A, wait for the response, then call tool B, and then have this manage yourself. Everything is handled by cloud automation. We are using events to then trigger your webhooks. What we also do, and I think, Rob, this is what you showed in the previous demos, it's not just that we are executing tasks through events. We also have a very strong integration with Dynatrace, where as you're moving through the tasks, you can also add what we call an evaluation step, where we can actively reach out to Dynatrace and then pull in certain key metrics, we call them SLIs and SLOs, evaluate them based on that, then decide in which direction we want to continue executing this particular sequence. And this is why this is so powerful. Loosely coupled, you can attach any type of tool to your processes, and everything is data-driven and event-driven. Yeah.
Perfect. Right.
Yeah.
and that's what this, Andy was referring to, this evaluation. So one of the built-in or reserved words in a sequence is called an evaluation, but it works exactly the same way. You're saying I have an evaluation triggered, and there's no programming, because the Dynatrace service is actually listening for that evaluation finished, and it does its work.
Yeah.
And then when it's done, it pushes back those results of that evaluation, and then and there's other activities too. So in Dynatrace service, it's also listening for a testing event and sends push info events into Dynatrace to let Dynatrace be aware that when a test occurred or when a deployment occurred. Mm-hmm. And then that's the whole idea. So this specification, it's based on this is really started in the cloud native compute foundation, and really trying to make things cloud native. And so this concept of this event structure is how we want this to be a standardized event. So we're building off of a cloud event, and then we're actually also pushing. There's another plug for the Continuous Delivery Foundation as well, where all these tools building point-to-point solutions, build some custom logic within Jenkins to do something else, and then I have a ticketing system. So all this legacy code and tons of spaghetti code can be the result of trying to tie tons of tools together. So by building an event-driven design with a control plane where events and services are subscribing to it is the architecture. And that's what makes it really powerful. So it's kind of low level stuff we're talking about, but I think once you think about an event-driven standard event way with subscribing services, it's a very more loosely coupled, flexible design. And that's hopefully I got a taste of it in today's demo.
Exactly. Hey, Rob, thank you so much for showing us the details about the webhooks. I can just encourage people to rewatch the demos you did for continuous delivery automation, but also for the problem remediation. These are the two major use cases. It's not just for delivery, but also for problem remediation. And right. If you want to get started,
yeah, I was gonna say, yes, as a plug, and we are working with a variety of partners across different domain areas: testing, chaos, ticketing, feature flags, and these are going to be pushed out into the Dynatrace Hub as little tiles, so that we'll have a complete example of how to configure it and use it, And we've got a lot of things planned to demo and blogs coming out. So this is a great, exciting area for cloud automation and building out the ecosystem. So definitely, get excited and again, share with us tools and things that you integrate with, share your use cases with Andy and I, and yeah, keep on checking it out. So
Exactly.
thank you.
Thank you, Rob. I'm sure I have you back with more integrations, and I'm pretty sure you will also show the individual integrations we have in another set of videos that you do as part of the Dynatrace Partner Cafe in the context of cloud automation. Cool.
All right.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Au revoir. Tschüss.